The year was 1885, and in the New Mexico territory, justice came with a price tag attached. Wanted posters papered every saloon wall, every sheriff's office, every crossroads where desperate men gathered to trade information for silver dollars. In this harsh landscape where law was scarce and survival was everything, one profession thrived above all others: bounty hunting. Jack Wolf Morrison was the best tracker in 3 territories. Cold as winter steel, relentless as a desert storm, he brought in over 40 fugitives without losing a single bounty. His reputation was built on one simple rule: bring them back no matter what it takes. Dead or alive, the reward was always the same. But rules have a way of shattering when you least expect them. Elena Santos was supposed to be just another name on just another wanted poster. $5,000 for the woman who allegedly robbed the Territorial Bank of Santa Fe, killing 2 guards in the process. The description was clear: dangerous, armed, and desperate. Every lawman from El Paso to Denver was hunting her. What nobody mentioned was that she had eyes like storm clouds and a spirit that refused to break, even when the whole world turned against her. Jack had tracked Elena for 6 days through canyon country that would kill most men, following signs so faint they barely existed. Broken twigs here, a hoof print there, the ghost of a trail that led deeper into wilderness where weaker men would have turned back. But Jack Morrison didn't know the meaning of surrender until he found the woman who would teach him the difference between capturing a criminal and saving an innocent life. This morning he'd found her in a box canyon with no way out, wounded and exhausted but still defiant. She looked nothing like the cold-blooded killer described on the wanted poster. She looked like someone who'd been wronged, someone fighting for truth in a world built on lies. That should have been Jack's first warning that everything he'd been told was a lie. You're about to witness how a bounty hunter's simple capture became the most dangerous mission of his life. How 4 words, "You're coming with me," sparked a chase across the territory that would test everything Jack thought he knew about justice, truth, and the price of choosing love over duty. This is the story of a hunt that became a rescue, a capture that became a liberation, and 2 hearts that found each other in the crossfire between corruption and courage. You'll see how Elena Santos turned from hunted fugitive to fearless fighter, and how Jack Morrison discovered that some bounties are worth more than all the silver in the world. Elena had no idea that her fight for justice would expose a conspiracy reaching from local ranches to territorial government. Jack had no idea that choosing to believe one woman's story would transform him from a man who hunted people for money into a man who protected people for love. All Elena knew was that powerful men had murdered her family and branded her a criminal for refusing to surrender her land. All Jack knew was that something in her storm cloud eyes told him the wanted poster was wrong. The chase was about to begin. The truth was about to surface, and everything both of them thought they knew about justice, loyalty, and the price of doing what's right was about to change forever. Sometimes the most valuable bounty isn't silver or gold. Sometimes it's something worth dying for. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to fight for it, it's something worth living for. The box canyon held the morning heat like a stone oven, but Elena Santos sat straight back beside her dying campfire, watching the man who'd finally caught up with her. Jack Morrison looked exactly like what he was, a predator who'd found his prey. Tall, lean, with eyes that missed nothing and hands that never strayed far from his weapons. But there was something else in those eyes, something that made Elena think he might actually listen before he decided whether to bring her back alive or draped over his saddle. "You planning to shoot me, or are we going to talk first?" Elena asked, her voice carrying more strength than she felt after 6 days of running through country that killed the unprepared. Jack kept his rifle ready but not aimed directly at her. "That depends on you, Miss Santos. I'm here to bring you back to Santa Fe. How that happens is your choice." Elena stood slowly, favoring her left ankle where she'd twisted it yesterday, climbing down into this canyon. She'd known it was a trap the moment she'd ridden in, but her horse needed water and she needed rest. Sometimes you had to choose between bad options and worse ones. "I suppose you're going to tell me I have the right to surrender peacefully," Elena said, and there was bitter laughter in her voice. "You have the right to make this easy on both of us." And if I tell you I'm innocent, if I tell you that warrant is based on lies and corruption, what then, Mr. Morrison, Jack Morrison? He studied her face in the harsh morning light. And I'd say I've heard that story before. I'm sure you have, but have you ever heard it from someone who could prove it? Jack felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he'd thought was dead and buried years ago. It might have been curiosity or doubt, or something more dangerous, the possibility that this time, the fugitive might be telling the truth. The bank in Santa Fe was robbed 3 weeks ago, Jack said, his voice steady as carved stone. 2 guards died. Witnesses saw a woman matching your description leaving the scene. Your horse was found 2 blocks away with the bank's money in the saddlebags. Elena's laugh was sharp and bitter. My horse, the one that was stolen from my ranch the night before the robbery. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Awful convenient for someone claiming innocence. Or awful convenient for someone who needed a scapegoat. Elena took a step forward, and Jack's finger moved closer to his trigger. Tell me, Mr. Morrison, did your investigation mention that my family owned the largest ranch in 3 counties? That we controlled water rights that certain powerful men wanted? That my father refused every offer to sell, no matter how much money they threw at him? Jack had read the wanted poster, studied the witness statements, memorized every detail of the case, but nobody had mentioned anything about a ranch or water rights. In his experience, bounty hunters weren't paid to investigate. They were paid to track and capture. Even if that's true, Jack said, it doesn't change the fact that there's a warrant with your name on it. $5,000 says you're guilty. And that's all that matters to you? The money? Jack was quiet for a moment, studying Elena's face. She was beautiful, even battered and exhausted from days of running. But more than that, she carried herself with a dignity that most guilty fugitives lost long before they were cornered. There was something in her eyes, pain, yes, and fear, but also a kind of righteous anger that spoke of someone who'd been wronged rather than someone who'd done wrong. The money matters, Jack said finally, but the truth matters more. Then help me prove it. That's not my job. Your job is to bring in Elena Santos, the bank robber. But what if Elena Santos isn't a bank robber? What if she's just a woman whose family was murdered for refusing to sell their land? Jack felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. Murdered? Elena's voice broke slightly. My father, my mother, my younger brother. Shot down in our own parlor 3 days after the bank robbery. The official story is that it was revenge, that associates of the dead guards tracked them down. But I know better. How? Because I was supposed to be there that night. I was supposed to die with them. But I'd ridden into town for supplies and got caught in a storm. By the time I made it home, Elena's voice trailed off, and for the first time since Jack had found her, she looked vulnerable rather than defiant. Jack lowered his rifle slightly. Every instinct he'd developed over years of bounty hunting told him that guilty people didn't tell stories like this. They begged. They bargained. They offered information about other criminals. They didn't weave elaborate tales of family murders and land grabs that could be easily checked. Who killed them? Jack asked. Men working for Harrison Caldwell. He's been buying up ranch land throughout the territory, and my father's property was the last piece he needed to control the entire water supply. When we wouldn't sell, he found another way to get what he wanted. Jack knew the name Harrison Caldwell. Everyone in the territory did. Caldwell was rich, powerful, and connected to politicians from Santa Fe to Washington. He was also smart enough not to get his own hands dirty when he wanted something done. You have proof of this? I have the deed to our land, hidden where Caldwell's men will never find it. I have letters my father wrote documenting Caldwell's threats. And I have something else. What? Elena reached slowly into her shirt, and Jack raised his rifle again. But instead of a weapon, she pulled out a small leather pouch. From inside, she withdrew a silver badge, tarnished but unmistakable. This belonged to one of the men who killed my family. He dropped it during the struggle with my father. It's got initials engraved on the back. T.R. Thomas Riley. He's one of Caldwell's hired guns. Jack examined the badge without taking it from Elena's hand. It looked real, and it would be easy enough to check whether Thomas Riley worked for Caldwell. But badges could be stolen, stories could be manufactured, and $5,000 was a lot of money to walk away from. based on a sad tale and a piece of silver. Miss Santos, Jack said slowly, I've been tracking fugitives for 8 years. I've heard every sob story, every claim of innocence, every elaborate explanation for why the evidence is wrong and the witnesses are lying. Most of the time, the simplest answer is the right one. Guilty people run because they're guilty. And what does your instinct tell you about me? Jack looked into Elena's storm cloud eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Doubt. Not about his abilities as a tracker, but about his certainties as a man who'd learned to see the world in terms of guilt and innocence, black and white, reward and punishment. My instinct, Jack said quietly, is telling me things I don't want to hear. Such as? Such as maybe this time, the simple answer is wrong. Elena felt hope flicker in her chest for the first time since she'd found her family's bodies. Then help me prove it. You're asking me to throw away my reputation, my livelihood, everything I built my life on. I'm asking you to help me find justice for my family. Jack holstered his rifle and walked closer to Elena, close enough to see the determination burning in her eyes despite her exhaustion. If I do this, if I help you instead of bringing you in, we'll both be fugitives. Caldwell has enough influence to put bounties on our heads. So you believe me? Jack was quiet for a long moment, weighing everything he knew against everything he felt. Finally, he reached out and took the badge from Elena's hand, studying the initials carved into the silver. I believe you enough to find out if Thomas Riley really works for Harrison Caldwell. And if he does, Jack met Elena's eyes, then you're coming with me, not as my prisoner, but as my partner. We're going to prove your innocence and bring down the men who destroyed your family. Elena felt tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spill down her cheeks. Why? Why would you risk everything for a stranger? Jack looked at this woman who'd shown more courage in 6 days of running than most people showed in a lifetime, and he knew his answer was going to change both their lives forever. Because sometimes doing what's right matters more than doing what's profitable. And because, Jack paused, then spoke the truth he'd only just realized. Because I think I've been hunting the wrong person. As the morning sun climbed higher above the canyon walls, Jack Morrison made a choice that would transform him from a hunter into a protector, from a man who captured fugitives into a man who fought for justice. You're coming with me, Jack said. And this time the words weren't a threat, they were a promise. 2 hours later, Jack Morrison was questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. Elena Santos rode beside him through the desert heat, her hands bound with rope but her spirit decidedly unbroken, while he wrestled with doubts that multiplied like storm clouds on the horizon. You're having second thoughts, Elena observed, reading the tension in his shoulders as easily as he read tracks in the dust. I'm having practical thoughts, Jack replied, scanning the ridgeline for signs of pursuit. If you're telling the truth about Harrison Caldwell, then we're riding into a war we can't win. If you're lying, then I've just thrown away my career for a clever story and a stolen badge. And if I'm telling the truth, then we're both dead if we get caught. Elena tested the ropes around her wrists, not to escape, but to gauge how much Jack still distrusted her. The bonds were secure, but not tight enough to cut off circulation. He was being careful, but not cruel. Why keep me tied up if you believe me? Jack was quiet for a moment, guiding his horse around a cluster of barrel cacti. Because believing you and trusting you are different things. You've got survival instincts sharp enough to stay ahead of every tracker in the territory for 6 days. That makes you dangerous, regardless of whether you rob that bank. And if I gave you my word not to run, would you keep it? Elena considered the question seriously. If you're really trying to help me prove my innocence, yes. If this is just another way to bring me in for the bounty, no. Jack admired her honesty, even as it frustrated him. Then I guess we both have trust issues to work through. They rode in silence through the morning heat, heading toward a line of mesas that marked the boundary between New Mexico territory and Texas. Jack had chosen this route deliberately. It was far from main roads, away from settlements where they might be recognized, and it led toward a place where he could verify Elena's story without alerting Caldwell's people. Fort Stockton sat just across the Texas border, and Jack had contacts there who owed him favors. If Thomas Riley really worked for Harrison Caldwell, the Army would have records. Military men kept detailed files on civilians who employed former soldiers, especially when those civilians operated in the gray areas between legal and criminal. "Where are we going?" Elena asked as the sun climbed toward its zenith. "Fort Stockton. I know a sergeant there who can check military records." "To verify that Thomas Riley works for Caldwell?" "To verify everything you've told me. If your story holds up, then we start planning how to prove your innocence. If it doesn't," Jack let the sentence hang unfinished. "If it doesn't, you collect your $5,000 and sleep soundly, knowing you did your job." Jack looked at Elena, studying the way she held herself despite the heat and exhaustion. "If your story doesn't hold up, Miss Santo, sleeping soundly will be the least of my problems. Because you'll have to live with turning in an innocent woman, because I'll have to live with being fool enough to believe her." Elena was quiet for a long moment, understanding the weight of what Jack was risking. His reputation, his livelihood, his future, all balanced on her word and a silver badge that might mean everything or nothing. "Tell me about yourself," Elena said finally. "How does a man become a bounty hunter?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Same way a man becomes anything in this territory, by surviving when others don't." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're getting." Elena studied Jack's profile as he rode. There were scars on his hands, old ones that spoke of violence survived rather than violence inflicted. His clothes were well made but practical, his weapons expertly maintained. Everything about him suggested competence and experience. But there was something else, a carefully controlled distance from the world around him. "You lost someone," Elena said quietly. Jack's hands tightened on his reins. "Don't. Someone close to you. That's why you understand what I'm going through." "I said don't. And that's why you're willing to risk everything to help me. Because you know what it feels like to want justice and have no way to get it." Jack pulled his horse to a stop so suddenly that Elena's mount nearly collided with him. When he turned to face her, his eyes held a warning that would have terrified most people. "Miss Santos, you don't know me well enough to guess at my motivations, and you don't want to push me hard enough to find out what happens when I stop being reasonable." Elena met his stare without flinching. "My entire family was murdered 3 weeks ago, Mr. Morrison. I've been running for my life, sleeping in caves, eating whatever I could catch or steal. I've been shot at, hunted like an animal, and branded a killer by people who've never met me. So forgive me if your threats don't particularly scare me." They stared at each other for a long moment, while the desert heat shimmered around them. Finally, Jack shook his head and urged his horse forward. "You've got steel in your spine, I'll give you that. I've got nothing left to lose. That tends to make a person bold." Bold or foolish? In my experience, there's not much difference. As they rode deeper into the empty country between territories, Jack found himself studying Elena more closely. She rode well despite her bound hands, adjusting automatically to her horse's gait and reading the terrain ahead. Her clothes were torn and dusty, but they'd been well made originally. Her boots were expensive leather, worn but not cheap. Everything about her supported the story she'd told. She looked like a rancher's daughter who'd been living rough, not like a bank robber who'd spent years perfecting her criminal skills. "The ranch your family owned," Jack said after another hour of riding. "How big was it?" 15,000 acres, prime grazing land with 3 natural springs and access to the Rio Bravo. My grandfather built it up from nothing after the Mexican War. And Caldwell wanted it why? Water rights, control the water, control everything for 100 miles in any direction. Our springs fed into the river system that supplies half the territory." Jack nodded. It made sense. In this country, water was more valuable than gold, and men had killed for far less than what Elena's family had controlled. "What was the final offer your father refused?" $200,000. Cash. Jack whistled low. That was enough money to buy half of Santa Fe. "And he turned it down?" "My father said some things weren't for sale. The land had been in our family for 40 years. My mother was buried there along with my grandparents. He wouldn't have sold for twice that amount. So Caldwell found another way to get what he wanted. Frame the daughter for bank robbery and murder. Kill the rest of the family in a revenge attack. Claim the land when there's no one left to contest his purchase from the territorial government. The plan was simple, brutal, and effective. Elena would hang for the bank robbery. Her family was already dead, and Caldwell would acquire their property for a fraction of its value through legal channels that no one would question. There's just one problem with Caldwell's plan, Jack said. What's that? You're still alive, and as long as you are, you can contest any sale of your family's land. Elena was quiet for a moment, which means he'll keep sending men to hunt me until I'm dead, or until we prove your innocence and put him in prison for murder. And how exactly do we do that? Caldwell has money, influence, and connections reaching all the way to Washington. We have my word, a badge that might belong to one of his men, and whatever evidence we can gather without getting killed. Jack looked at Elena, and for the first time since he'd found her in that canyon, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the grin of a predator who'd found interesting prey. Miss Santos, you're thinking like someone who's been running. But I'm not in the habit of running from anyone, no matter how much money or influence they have. What are you in the habit of doing? Hunting. And now that I know who the real criminals are, the hunt is just beginning. Elena felt something stir in her chest, hope, or maybe just relief that she was no longer facing this fight alone. So what's our first move? We prove Thomas Riley works for Caldwell. Then we figure out how to make him tell us who really robbed that bank. And if he won't talk? Jack's smile grew colder. Then we'll have to be persuasive. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, they took shelter in the shadow of a red rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant. Jack loosened Elena's bonds so she could drink from his canteen and eat some of the jerky from his pack. Why are you really doing this? Elena asked as they shared the meager meal. Jack was quiet for a long time, staring out at the endless expanse of desert that stretched toward the horizon. Because 8 years ago, I made a choice to stop caring about right and wrong and focus only on what paid. That choice has kept me alive, but it's also kept me alone. And now I'm thinking maybe it's time to remember what I used to believe in. Elena studied Jack's face, seeing past the hardness to something that might have been regret. What happened 8 years ago? Jack stood up abruptly, checking his weapons and scanning the surrounding rocks for signs of movement. Nothing that matters now. We need to keep moving if we want to reach Fort Stockton by nightfall. But as they rode through the baking afternoon heat, Elena saw the truth that Jack was trying to hide. 8 years ago, he'd lost someone important enough that losing them had changed him from whatever he'd been before into the cold, efficient bounty hunter she'd met in that canyon. And now, for reasons he probably didn't fully understand himself, he was risking everything to help her find justice for her own loss. Elena tested her bonds again, and this time she wasn't checking to see how tight they were. She was checking to see if she wanted to escape. She didn't. For the first time in weeks, Elena Santos felt like she might not be facing the future alone. Fort Stockton squatted on the Texas plains like a weathered fist, its adobe walls baked brown by decades of desert sun. Jack Morrison had been here before, but never with a wanted woman riding beside him, and questions that could get them both killed if the wrong people heard them. Sergeant William Bull Harrigan emerged from the quartermaster's office as Jack and Elena approached the main gate. Harrigan was built like his nickname suggested. Broad, powerful, and not inclined towards subtle thinking. But he owed Jack his life, and in this territory, that kind of debt carried more weight than money. "Well, I'll be damned," Harrigan called out, his voice carrying across the dusty parade ground. Jack Morrison riding up to my post with a woman in tow. "You finally decided to get married?" "Not exactly, Bull. I need a favor." Harrigan's expression shifted as he noticed Elena's bound hands and the tension in Jack's posture. "Official business, unofficial, and private. The kind of private that gets a man court-martialed, the kind that gets a man killed if he's not careful." Harrigan was quiet for a moment, studying Elena with the eye of someone who'd learned to read people quickly. "She the Santos woman? The one wanted for that bank job in Santa Fe?" Jack nodded. "Among other things. And you're bringing her in?" "I'm trying to figure out if she needs bringing in at all." Harrigan's eyebrows rose. "That's not like you, Jack. You've never cared about guilt or innocence before." Maybe I'm getting old. Or maybe you're getting soft. Harrigan gestured toward his office. Come on, let's hear what kind of trouble you're trying to drag me into. 20 minutes later, Jack, Elena, and Harrigan sat around a bottle of whiskey that had seen better days. Elena's hands were still bound, but Harrigan had provided her with water and a chair that didn't face the door. A small gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed. Thomas Riley, Harrigan said, flipping through a thick ledger. Discharged from the Army 3 years ago. Conduct unbecoming an officer. Suspected of selling weapons to civilians, but we couldn't prove it. What kind of civilian? Jack asked. The kind with money and flexible morals. According to the reports, Riley was recruiting other discharged soldiers for private work. Security, they called it. Elena leaned forward. What kind of security? Harrigan looked at her for the first time since they'd entered his office. The kind where people end up dead and no one asks questions? Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. Any record of who he was working for? Officially? Number unofficially? Harrigan took a long drink from the bottle. Harrison Caldwell's name came up more than once during the investigation. Elena's breath caught. Then it's true. Riley does work for Caldwell. Worked, Harrigan corrected. Past tense, Riley's dead. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Jack exchanged glances with Elena, both of them understanding what this meant. When? Jack asked. 2 weeks ago, found shot in an alley behind a saloon in El Paso. No witnesses, no arrests. Any idea who killed him? Harrigan shrugged. Could have been anyone. Riley had a talent for making enemies. But the timing is interesting, considering that bank robbery happened 3 weeks ago. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. They killed him to cover their tracks. Or someone else killed him for reasons that had nothing to do with any bank robbery, Harrigan said. Dead men make convenient scapegoats. Jack pulled the silver badge from his pocket and placed it on the table. This belonged to him, found at the scene of a triple murder. Harrigan examined the badge without touching it. Could be his, could be stolen, could be planted. Badge proves he was there, but it doesn't prove who killed him or why. But it supports Miss Santos's story. It supports the possibility that her story is true. That's not the same thing as proof. Elena felt frustration building in her chest. What would constitute proof? A signed confession from Harrison Caldwell? That would be a start, Harrigan said dryly, along with witnesses, physical evidence, and testimony from someone with credibility. And we have none of those things. You have the beginning of a case. Whether you can build it into something that will stand up in court is another question entirely. Jack stood up, pacing to the window that looked out over the fort's parade ground. Bull, what do you know about Caldwell's current operations? More than I should and less than I'd like. He's got contracts with the Army to supply beef to 3 forts. He's also got political connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital. Word is he's planning to run for territorial delegate when statehood comes. Hard to do that with murder charges hanging over your head. Hard to make murder charges stick when you've got half the territorial government in your pocket. Elena looked between the two men, reading the subtext of their conversation. You're saying even if we prove Caldwell killed my family, he's too powerful to prosecute? I'm saying the law works differently for different people, Harrigan replied. Rich, connected people get trials where evidence mysteriously disappears and witnesses suddenly develop poor memories. Poor, powerless people get hung on whatever charges are convenient. That's not justice. No, miss, that's politics. Jack turned from the window, his face grim. Bull, I need current information on Caldwell's people. Who's working for him now? Where they're stationed? How many men he's got? You planning something stupid, Jack? I'm planning something necessary. Harrigan was quiet for a long moment, weighing friendship against professional obligation. The kind of necessary that gets people killed? The kind that prevents innocent people from getting killed. There's a difference? Jack met his friend's eyes. There is when you're the innocent person. Harrigan sighed and pulled another ledger from his desk. Caldwell's got a ranch operation about 50 miles north of here. Main house, bunkhouse, probably 20 men on the payroll. Most of them are former soldiers. Cavalry, infantry, some artillery. They're well armed and well trained. Any idea who's in charge of security? Man named Marcus Webb, Former captain, discharged for conduct unbecoming. Same charges as Riley, but Webb was smarter about covering his tracks. Elena felt a chill of recognition. I know that name. He was one of the men who approached my father about selling the ranch. Pleasant on the surface, but there was something underneath. Something dangerous. That would be Webb, Harrigan said. Polite as Sunday service until he doesn't get what he wants. Then people start having accidents. Jack was making mental notes, already planning approaches and escape routes. What kind of defenses does the ranch have? Jack, Harrigan said, his voice carrying a warning. Whatever you're thinking, don't. Caldwell's not some two-bit outlaw you can track down and arrest. He's got money, influence, and enough firepower to start his own war. Maybe it's time someone started a war with him. And maybe it's time you remembered that dead heroes don't collect bounties. Elena stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. Mr. Harrigan, my family is dead. I'm wanted for crimes I didn't commit. Every law officer in 3 territories is hunting me. What exactly do I have to lose by fighting back? Your life, for starters. What kind of life? Running forever? Looking over my shoulder until someone finally puts a bullet in me? That's not living. That's just postponing death. Harrigan looked at Elena with new respect. Miss Santos, I believe you're telling the truth about that bank robbery. I also believe you're about to get yourself and my friend killed if you go up against Harrison Caldwell. Then help us, Elena said. Give us the information we need to do this right. I'm not asking for official help. I'm asking for the kind of help one decent person gives another when the law has failed. Harrigan was quiet for a long time, studying Elena's face. Finally, he opened the ledger again. Caldwell's ranch sits in a valley with only 2 approaches. North Road is the main road, well-guarded, heavily traveled. South Road is older, rougher, but it leads right up to the back of the property. Jack leaned over the table, memorizing the details. What about the house itself? Adobe construction, thick walls, built like a fortress. But there's a weak point. Old mine shaft about a quarter-mile from the main house. It's been abandoned for years, but it connects to a series of natural caves that run under the whole valley. How do you know all this? Harrigan smiled grimly. Because 3 years ago, the Army conducted a survey of the area for potential military installations. I was part of the surveying team. Elena felt hope stir in her chest. So we could get close to the house without being seen. If you're lucky and skilled and probably crazy, the caves are dangerous, unstable in places, flooded in others. And even if you make it to the house, you're still outnumbered 20-1. Jack was already working through the logistics. We don't need to fight 20 men. We just need to get to Webb and make him talk. And then what? Even if he confesses, who's going to believe the word of 2 fugitives against Harrison Caldwell? Elena pulled a folded paper from inside her shirt. Someone might believe this. She handed the document to Harrigan, who unfolded it carefully. His eyes widened as he read. This is a deed to 15,000 acres of prime ranch land. Signed, witnessed, and legally filed. My father gave it to me for safekeeping the week before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure it didn't fall into the wrong hands. This proves you own the land Caldwell wants. And it proves he has motive for murder. Combined with Webb's confession, you might have enough evidence to interest a federal judge, Harrigan finished. Assuming you can stay alive long enough to present it. Jack stood up, his mind already racing ahead to plans and preparations. Bull, we're going to need supplies, food, ammunition, rope, and we're going to need them without any official record of the transaction. Jack, I know what I'm asking, and I know what it could cost you. But Elena's right. Sometimes the law fails and decent people have to take matters into their own hands. Harrigan looked between Jack and Elena, seeing the determination in both their faces. You're really going to do this, aren't you? We're really going to try. Then God help you both, because if Caldwell doesn't kill you, the territorial government probably will. As the sun set over Fort Stockton, Jack Morrison and Elena Santos prepared for the most dangerous gamble of their lives. They had proof of motive, evidence of conspiracy, and a plan that might get them close enough to Harrison Caldwell's operation to find the truth. They also had powerful enemies, Overwhelming odds in each other. Sometimes that was enough. The abandoned mine shaft looked like the mouth of hell in the pre-dawn darkness. Jack Morrison crouched at its edge, studying the ropes and pulleys that would carry them down into the caves beneath Harrison Caldwell's ranch. Beside him, Elena Santos checked her weapons for the third time, her bound hands finally freed after 2 days of riding together. "You sure about this?" Jack asked, though he already knew Elena's answer. "I've been sure since the moment I found my family's bodies." "The question is whether you're sure." Jack looked at Elena in the pale starlight. 3 days ago, she'd been just another bounty. Now she was his partner in what amounted to a suicide mission. The transformation should have worried him more than it did. "I'm sure enough." They descended into darkness using ropes Bull Harrigan had borrowed from the fort's supplies. The caves were exactly as he described, a maze of natural tunnels carved by underground rivers that had dried up decades ago. Some passages were wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. Others forced them to crawl single file through spaces barely wider than their bodies. "How do we know we're going the right direction?" Elena whispered as they navigated a particularly narrow section. "We don't. We follow the main tunnel and hope Harrigan's survey maps were accurate. And if they weren't, then we get lost in the dark, and Caldwell never has to worry about us again." After 2 hours of underground travel, they saw light ahead. Not sunlight, but the warm glow of oil lamps filtering down through cracks in stone. Jack held up his hand, signaling for silence, and they crept forward until they could hear voices above them. "Told you, Webb wants it done tonight. No more waiting, no more planning. The Santos woman dies, and this whole mess gets buried with her." Jack and Elena exchanged glances. They'd found Caldwell's men, but the men had also found them, or at least knew they were in the area. "What about Morrison?" Word is he's switched sides, gone soft for the girl. Morrison's reputation dies with him. 2 fugitives killed while resisting arrest. Clean and simple. Elena felt rage building in her chest, but Jack's steady hand on her arm kept her from doing something reckless. They needed to hear more before they acted. "How many men are we talking about?" a third voice asked. 6 should be enough. Morrison's good, but he's not bulletproof, and the woman's just a rancher's daughter playing at being an outlaw. Jack smiled grimly. These men were about to learn that underestimating Elena Santos was a fatal mistake. "When do we move?" the first voice asked. "Soon as Webb gives the word. He's meeting with Caldwell now, getting final approval." Jack motioned for Elena to follow him deeper into the caves. When they were far enough away to speak without being overheard, he outlined his plan. 6 men hunting us means 14 men still at the ranch. If we can take out the hunting party quietly, we even the odds a little. And then what? Even with better odds, we're still outnumbered. Then we get creative. These caves run under the whole valley. If we can create enough confusion, enough chaos, maybe we can get to Webb before Caldwell's people know what's happening. Elena checked her ammunition. "How do we take out 6 armed men without alerting the ranch?" Very carefully, and with a lot of luck. They spent the next hour positioning themselves in the caves directly beneath where Caldwell's men were preparing for their hunt. When the hunting party finally moved out, Jack and Elena were ready. The first man died without making a sound, Jack's knife finding his heart before he could cry out. The second man noticed his partner's absence too late. Elena's rifle butt connected with his skull, dropping him unconscious into the dust. By the time the remaining 4 men realized they were being hunted, Jack and Elena had disappeared back into the underground maze, leaving only bodies and questions behind. "What the hell is happening?" one of the survivors shouted. "Morrison! Has to be! He knows these caves somehow." "Impossible! Nobody knows about the tunnel system except—" The man's words were cut off by Jack's pistol shot, fired from a concealed position 50 yards away. The remaining 3 men took cover behind rocks and scrub brush, but they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see in terrain they didn't understand. "Fall back to the ranch," one of them yelled. "Get reinforcements." But Elena was already positioned between them in their escape route, her rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. Another man fell, then another, until only 1 survivor remained to carry news of the disaster back to Harrison Caldwell. "Let him go," Jack said when Elena raised her rifle for a final shot. "We want Caldwell to know we're coming." "Why?" "Because scared men make mistakes. And we're going to need Caldwell to make a big one if we're going to survive this. 2 hours later, Harrison Caldwell stood in his study, listening to his surviving employee describe the ambush with growing fury. Marcus Webb sat across from him, his face stone cold with professional interest. "Morrison's better than we thought," Webb said, "and the woman's not the helpless rancher's daughter we expected." "I don't care how good they are," Caldwell snapped. "I want them dead. Tonight." "That might not be as easy as you think. They know these caves, they're well armed, and they've just proved they can pick off our men one by one." Caldwell turned to stare out his window at the darkness beyond. "Then we change the game. Instead of hunting them, we make them come to us. How? We give them something they want more than their own lives." Webb raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" "The truth. Or at least, the promise of it." Caldwell smiled coldly. "Send word that I'm willing to negotiate, that I have information about who really robbed that bank, and I'm willing to trade it for safe passage out of the territory. You think they'll believe that? I think they're desperate enough to risk it, and desperate people make the same kind of mistakes that scared people do." In the caves beneath the ranch, Jack and Elena made their own plans. They'd evened the odds slightly, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. Worse, they were running out of time. Every hour they spent hiding underground was another hour for Caldwell to bring in reinforcements or alert territorial authorities to their location. "We need to end this tonight," Jack said, "one way or another." "Agreed. But how do we get close enough to Webb to make him talk?" "We walk through the front door." Elena stared at Jack in the flickering lamplight. "That's your plan? Walk into a heavily defended ranch house and politely ask Webb to confess to murder?" "More or less." "Jack, that's not a plan. That's suicide." "Maybe, but it's also the last thing they'll expect." Jack checked his weapons one final time. "These caves exit near the main house. If we move fast, hit hard, and create enough chaos, we might be able to reach Webb before they can organize a proper defense." "And then what?" "Even if we make him confess, how do we get out alive?" Jack looked at Elena, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. Not fear, but determination mixed with something that might have been love. "Elena, there's something you need to understand. I didn't just switch sides because I believed your story. I switched sides because somewhere in the last 3 days, this stopped being about justice and started being about you." Elena felt her breath catch. "Jack, let me finish. If we don't make it out of this alive, I want you to know that helping you has been the most worthwhile thing I've done in 8 years. Whatever happens tonight, I don't regret choosing you over the bounty." Elena reached out and took Jack's hand, feeling calluses and scars that told the story of a hard life lived on dangerous ground. "Then let's make sure we both live to see what comes after tonight." As midnight approached, Jack Morrison and Elena Santos prepared for their final gamble. They had weapons, they had determination, and they had each other. Against Harrison Caldwell's money, influence, and private army, it would have to be enough. Midnight came to the Caldwell Ranch like a harbinger of judgment. Jack Morrison and Elena Santos emerged from the cave system 50 yards from the main house, moving through shadows that seemed to part before them like water. The ranch was quiet, too quiet for a place that should have been buzzing with activity after the evening's losses. "It's a trap," Elena whispered. "Of course it is," Jack replied. "The question is whether we're walking into their trap or they're walking into ours." They approached the house from the blind side, where the kitchen and servants' quarters blocked the view from the main rooms. Jack had noticed during his reconnaissance that this section of the building was older, built before Caldwell had money for proper security considerations. The kitchen window was unlatched, either carelessness or bait. Jack decided he didn't care which. Inside the darkened house, they moved like ghosts through corridors lined with expensive furniture and paintings that spoke of wealth built on other people's suffering. Elena felt rage building in her chest as she recognized some of the artwork, pieces that had belonged to other ranching families who'd mysteriously lost their land to Caldwell over the years. "Study's upstairs," Jack whispered, following the layout Bull Harrigan had described. "If Webb's here, that's where we'll find him." They climbed the main staircase, each step carefully placed to avoid creaking boards. At the top, light showed under a door at the end of the hall, warm lamplight that suggested someone was awake and waiting. Jack reached for the door handle, then froze. Elena was beside him an instant later, reading the same signs he'd noticed. The faint sound of breathing that didn't match the rhythm of sleep, the subtle shift of weight on floorboards, the metallic click of a gun being cocked. There were at least 3 men in that room, and they knew exactly where Jack and Elena were. "Mr. Morrison," came a voice from behind the door. "Miss Santos, please come in. We've been expecting you." Jack and Elena exchanged glances. They could retreat, try to find another way, spend the rest of the night playing cat and mouse through a house full of armed men, or they could face the trap head-on and hope their desperation gave them an edge that preparation couldn't match. Jack kicked open the door and dove left. Elena rolled right, both of them moving before their enemies could adjust to the sudden assault. Gunfire erupted immediately, muzzle flashes lighting the study like lightning bolts. Jack's first shot took down a man positioned behind an overturned desk. Elena's rifle found another gunman before he could fully clear his weapon from its holster. But the third man, Marcus Webb himself, was ready for their attack. Webb's bullet caught Jack in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a bookshelf. Elena turned her rifle toward Webb, but the former cavalry captain was already moving, using the confusion to position himself behind Harrison Caldwell's massive oak desk. "Impressive," Webb called out, his voice calm despite the violence, "but not impressive enough." More footsteps echoed in the hallway, reinforcements arriving exactly as planned. Jack and Elena were trapped in a room with limited cover, facing professional killers who knew the terrain better than they did. "Miss Santos," Webb continued conversationally, "you've caused me considerable inconvenience. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to organize a proper frame-up when the intended victim refuses to cooperate by dying?" Elena kept her rifle trained on the desk, waiting for Webb to show himself. "Not as difficult as it's going to be to explain all these bodies to the territorial authorities." "What bodies?" "As far as anyone will know, you and Morrison died in a tragic shootout while resisting arrest. Very sad, but these things happen when criminals become desperate." Jack was bleeding freely from his shoulder wound, but he managed to reload his pistol one-handed. "Funny thing about frame-ups, Webb. They only work when you control all the evidence." "And what evidence would that be? The word of 2 dead fugitives?" Elena smiled grimly. "How about the written confession of Thomas Riley?" For the first time, Webb's voice lost its calm confidence. "Riley's dead. Dead but not silent. Seems he wrote down everything before you killed him. Names, dates, details about the bank robbery and who really planned it. Amazing what a guilty conscience can produce." It was a bluff. Elena had no such confession, but she could hear uncertainty creeping into Webb's voice. "You're lying." "Am I? Care to bet your life on it?" Webb's hesitation was all Jack needed. Despite his wounded shoulder, he rolled behind a heavy leather chair and put 2 bullets into the desk where Webb was hiding. The oak was thick, but not thick enough to stop. 45 caliber rounds fired at close range. Webb cried out and stumbled into view, clutching his side. Elena had her rifle aimed at his chest before he could raise his own weapon. "Drop it," Elena commanded. Webb looked at the rifle pointed at his heart, then at Jack's pistol, then at the doorway where his reinforcements should have appeared by now. The sound of fighting echoed from downstairs. Gunfire, shouting, the crash of furniture being overturned. "What the hell?" Webb began. "Territorial marshals," Jack said, though he was as surprised as Webb by the sounds of battle below. "Seems someone tipped them off about this little gathering." Elena kept her rifle steady. "Last chance, Webb. Tell us the truth about the bank robbery, or I shoot you where you stand." Webb's face twisted with pain and rage. "You want the truth? The truth is that your father was a stubborn old fool who wouldn't recognize reality when it stared him in the face. Caldwell offered him a fortune for that land, and he threw it back like it was pocket change. So you killed him for it. I killed him because he left us no choice. That water rights case was going to federal court. If your family won, it would have tied up development for years. Caldwell had investors, deadlines, political commitments. Your father's principles were costing real money." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, but her aim never wavered. And the bank robbery? Simple misdirection. frame the daughter for a violent crime, eliminate the family in a revenge killing, purchase the land from the territorial government at bankruptcy prices. Clean, efficient, profitable. Who robbed the bank? Webb's laugh was bitter. 3 of Caldwell's men, led by Riley. They even used your horse to make sure the evidence pointed in the right direction. Riley was supposed to disappear afterward, make it look like he'd been killed by angry citizens seeking justice. But you killed him instead. Riley got greedy, started talking about wanting a bigger share of the profits. Dead men don't negotiate. The confession was everything Elena had hoped for, but she knew it would die with Webb unless they could get him out of this house alive. The fighting downstairs was getting closer, and whoever had come to their rescue might not be able to reach them in time. "Jack," Elena said without taking her eyes off Webb, "can you move?" "Well enough." "Then we're leaving. Now." Webb straightened despite his wound. "You'll never make it out alive. This house is surrounded." "Maybe, but you're coming with us, so you'd better hope we do." They moved toward the window that opened onto the roof of the kitchen addition. It was a dangerous escape route, but it was their only chance of avoiding the battle raging in the main part of the house. Jack went first, grimacing as his wounded shoulder protested the climb. Elena followed, keeping her rifle trained on Webb, while forcing him to move ahead of her. On the kitchen roof, they could see the full scope of the battle below. Federal marshals, at least a dozen of them, had surrounded the ranch and were systematically clearing the buildings. Caldwell's men were fighting back, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. "How did they know?" Webb gasped. "Sometimes justice finds a way," Elena replied, though she was as puzzled as Webb by the marshal's arrival. They made their way across the roof toward the barn, where horses waited in the corral. Behind them, the sound of the battle was fading as Caldwell's resistance collapsed under professional assault. But as they reached the edge of the roof, a figure stepped out of the shadows below. Harrison Caldwell himself, immaculately dressed despite the chaos, pointing a rifle at the 3 figures silhouetted against the starlight. "End of the line," Caldwell called out. "Miss Santos, Mr. Morrison, thank you for bringing me my wayward employee. Marcus, I'm afraid your services are no longer required." Caldwell's rifle swung toward Webb, but Elena was faster. Her shot took Caldwell in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the darkness. They dropped from the roof as federal marshals swarmed the area. Elena kept her weapon trained on both Caldwell and Webb while Jack struggled to remain upright despite his blood loss. A familiar voice called out from the darkness, "Elena! Jack! Stand down! Federal marshals!" Bull Harrigan emerged from the shadows wearing a deputy marshal's badge and leading a squad of armed men. Elena felt relief flood through her as she realized what had happened. "Bull, how?" "Soon as you left Fort Stockton, I sent word to every federal marshal in 3 territories. Took them a while to organize a response, but when they moved hard." Caldwell struggled to his feet, his expensive clothes torn and bloody. "Marshal, You demand nothing," Harrigan interrupted. "Harrison Caldwell, Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, bank robbery, and about 15 other federal crimes." As dawn broke over the New Mexico territory, Elena Santos watched federal marshals lead Harrison Caldwell and Marcus Webb away in chains. The men who destroyed her family, stolen her life, and branded her a criminal were finally facing justice. Jack Morrison sat beside her on the porch of the ranch house, his shoulder bandaged but his spirit intact. "So what happens now?" he asked. Elena looked at the deed to her family's land, now legally hers once again. "Now I rebuild, not just the ranch, but everything they tried to destroy. Need any help with that?" Elena smiled and took Jack's uninjured hand in hers. "I might know a good man who's looking for honest work." "What makes you think he's looking for honest work?" "Because he chose justice over money. That's the kind of man worth keeping around." As the sun climbed higher, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of golden promise, Elena Santos and Jack Morrison began planning a future neither of them had dared to imagine just a week before. Sometimes justice came with a badge and federal authority. Sometimes it came with courage and determination. And sometimes it came with love. 6 months later, the Santos Ranch looked nothing like the abandoned property Elena had inherited from her murdered family. New fences marked the boundaries, fresh timber framed a rebuilt barn, and cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that had been empty for too long. But the most remarkable change wasn't in the buildings or the livestock. It was in the woman who stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elena Santos Morrison, she'd taken Jack's name 3 months ago in a ceremony attended by half the territorial marshals and most of Fort Stockton's garrison, no longer looked like a fugitive running for her life. She looked like what she'd become, a rancher, a wife, and a woman who'd fought for justice and won. Jack rode up to the house as the first stars appeared, his shoulder fully healed and his expression carrying the satisfaction of a day's honest work completed. Behind him, 3 cowboys from town drove a small herd of horses toward the corral, Mustangs he'd captured and gentled for sale to the army. "How'd the negotiations go?" Elena asked as Jack dismounted and climbed the porch steps. "Better than expected. Colonel Martinez wants 50 horses for the spring campaign. Payment on delivery, cash in advance for half the order." Elena smiled. Jack Morrison, legitimate horse trader. Who would have believed it? Sometimes I don't believe it myself. Jack settled into the chair beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Bull stopped by while you were in town. He had news about the trial." Elena's expression grew serious. Harrison Caldwell's trial had been the talk of the territory for months, the first time a man of his wealth and influence had faced federal charges for murder and conspiracy. "What kind of news?" "Guilty on all counts. Caldwell's going to prison for the rest of his life. Webb too, assuming he lives long enough to serve his sentence." Elena felt a weight she'd been carrying for months finally lift from her shoulders. "It's really over then?" "The legal part is over. The rest—" Jack took her hand, intertwining their fingers with the ease of long practice. "The rest is just beginning." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the ranch. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the valley, but their songs no longer sounded like warnings. They sounded like the natural music of a land at peace. "Jack," Elena said quietly, "do you ever regret giving up bounty hunting?" Jack was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret some of the things I did as a bounty hunter. I regret some of the people I brought in who maybe didn't deserve what happened to them. But giving it up? I don't regret that at all. Not even when the bank drafts are late and the cattle prices drop? Especially not then." Jack squeezed Elena's hand. "You know what I've learned in the last 6 months? There's a difference between making a living and making a life. For 8 years, I made a good living hunting people. But I wasn't making a life worth living." Elena leaned against Jack's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "And now? Now I wake up every morning next to the woman I love, work land that belongs to us, build something that'll last longer than either of us. That's not just a life, that's a legacy." A rider approached from the south, moving at an easy pace that suggested business rather than emergency. As he drew closer, they recognized Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley, one of Bull Harrigan's men who'd helped with the raid on Caldwell's ranch. "Evening, folks," Bradley called out as he dismounted. "Sorry to disturb you, but I've got official business." Elena felt a familiar chill of worry. What kind of official business? Bradley pulled a folded document from his saddlebag. "The kind that pays well if you're interested." Jack frowned. "Tom, I'm not in the bounty hunting business anymore." "This isn't about bounty hunting. This is about consulting." Bradley unfolded the document, revealing an official federal marshal's commission. "Territorial authorities want to hire you both as special consultants. Seems there are other powerful men in other territories who've been taking liberties with the law, and the federal government wants investigators who understand how these operations work." Elena and Jack exchanged glances. "What exactly would we be investigating?" "Land fraud, mostly. Political corruption. Cases where local authorities can't or won't pursue justice because the criminals have too much influence." Bradley's expression grew serious. "Cases like yours where innocent people are being framed or killed because they stand in the way of powerful interests." Jack leaned back in his chair. "And the federal government thinks we're qualified for this kind of work?" "The federal government thinks you've already proved you're qualified. You took down Harrison Caldwell when every law officer in 3 territories was afraid to touch him. You exposed a conspiracy that reached from Santa Fe to Washington, and you did it without any official support or legal authority. Elena felt something stirring in her chest, not the old rage and desperation that had driven her during her fugitive days, but something newer and more focused. How many cases are we talking about? As many as you're willing to take. The pay is good, the authority is real, and you'd be working directly for federal judges who can't be bought or intimidated. Jack looked at Elena, reading the interest in her eyes. What do you think? I think there are probably a lot of people out there who need the kind of help we needed 6 months ago. People who've been wronged by men like Caldwell, but don't have the skills or resources to fight back. And you want to help them? Elena stood up, walking to the porch railing and looking out over the land she'd reclaimed from her family's killers. Jack, we spent months learning how these conspiracies work, how corrupt men hide behind money and influence. We know their methods, their weaknesses, their fears. Why shouldn't we use that knowledge to help other innocent people? Jack joined her at the railing. Because it's dangerous. Because every case would put us back in the crosshairs of powerful enemies. Because we've already fought our war and won. Why risk everything we've built? Because building something worth protecting isn't enough if you're not willing to protect it for others too. Jack studied Elena's profile in the starlight, seeing the determination that had first attracted him to her, burning as bright as ever. You're sure about this? I'm sure that we were given skills and knowledge for a reason. I'm sure that there are families out there facing the same injustices we faced, and I'm sure that we're uniquely qualified to help them. Bradley cleared his throat. I don't need an answer tonight. Think it over, talk it through. But if you decide you're interested, the federal government is prepared to make you an offer that'll let you keep this ranch and help people at the same time. After Bradley left, Elena and Jack walked through their rebuilt home, past the kitchen where they'd shared countless meals, through the parlor where they'd planned their future, into the bedroom where they'd learned what it meant to trust completely. Elena, Jack said as they prepared for bed, if we do this, if we take on these cases, everything changes. We won't just be ranchers anymore. We'll be investigators, constantly traveling, always in danger. And if we don't do it, we'll always wonder if we could have made a difference for people who needed help. Jack pulled Elena into his arms, holding her close enough to feel her heart beat against his chest. Then I guess we're going to find out how good we really are at fighting other people's wars. Elena smiled against Jack's shoulder. Together? Together. A year later, Jack and Elena Morrison had become legends throughout the American West, not as outlaws or bounty hunters, but as federal investigators who specialized in cases that seemed impossible to solve. They'd exposed 3 more land fraud conspiracies, brought down a corrupt territorial judge, and helped dozens of families reclaim property that had been stolen through legal manipulation. Their ranch remained their home base, but it had also become something more, a sanctuary for people seeking justice when the official channels had failed them. Widows whose husbands had been murdered for their claims. Farmers whose land had been seized through fraudulent debt proceedings. Immigrants who'd been cheated by unscrupulous business partners. Elena stood on the same porch where she'd once watched for enemies, now watching Jack work with a group of young horses in the corral. Their life had become more complicated, more dangerous, and infinitely more meaningful than either of them had imagined possible. She'd learned that justice wasn't something you found. It was something you created through courage, determination, and the willingness to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. And she'd learned that love wasn't just about finding someone to share your happiness with. It was about finding someone willing to share your battles, your risks, your commitment to making the world a little more fair for everyone. Jack finished with the horses and walked toward the house, his stride confident and his smile bright enough to light up the gathering dusk. In a few days, they'd leave for Colorado Territory to investigate reports of mining claims being stolen through manufactured legal disputes. It would be dangerous work, but it would also be necessary work. Ready for the next adventure? Jack asked as he climbed the porch steps. Elena took his hand and squeezed it tight. With you, I'm ready for anything. As stars emerged in the clear New Mexico sky, Elena Santos Morrison and Jack Morrison planned their next mission in their ongoing war against injustice. They'd learned that some battles never truly end. They just evolve into new forms, requiring new strategies and renewed commitment. But they'd also learned that love and justice made powerful allies, and that two people who truly trusted each other could face any enemy, overcome any obstacle, and build something beautiful from even the most unpromising beginnings. Their story had started with a bounty hunter's pursuit and a desperate woman's flight from false accusations. It had become something far more precious, a partnership forged in fire, tested by danger, and strengthened by shared commitment to protecting the innocent. Sometimes the most valuable treasures weren't gold or silver. Sometimes they were the bonds between people who chose to fight for what was right, no matter what it cost them. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those bonds lasted forever. And so, in the unforgiving landscape of the New Mexico territory, a bounty hunter's simple pursuit became something extraordinary. Jack Morrison discovered that sometimes the most valuable reward isn't the one posted on a wanted poster. It's the one you find when you choose justice over profit, love over duty. Elena Santos learned that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about staying true to who you are, even when the whole world tries to convince you that you're someone else. Her fight for justice didn't just clear her name, it exposed the corruption that threatened every honest family in the territory. Together, Jack and Elena proved that two people who trust each other completely can overcome any odds, defeat any enemy, and build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Their love story wasn't written in candlelit dinners or flowery speeches. It was forged in gunfire and danger, sealed with shared sacrifice, and strengthened by a common commitment to protecting the innocent. The Santos Ranch became more than just a home. It became a symbol of what could be accomplished when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Families across 3 territories knew that if powerful men tried to steal their land, murder their loved ones, or frame them for crimes they didn't commit, there were 2 federal investigators who would listen, believe, and fight back. Jack Morrison, who'd spent 8 years hunting people for money, discovered that protecting people for love was infinitely more rewarding. He never collected another bounty, but he found something worth more than all the silver in the territory. A purpose that made every morning worth greeting, every risk worth taking. Elena Santos Morrison, who'd lost everything and been branded a criminal, rebuilt her life into something stronger and more meaningful than what she'd had before. She turned her pain into power, her loss into a weapon against those who preyed on the innocent. Their legacy lives on in every person who chooses courage over comfort, truth over convenience. Jack was just an ordinary bounty hunter who made an extraordinary choice on one dusty morning in a box canyon. Elena was just a rancher's daughter who refused to surrender when powerful men demanded her silence. What would you have done if you'd been in Jack's position, faced with choosing between a guaranteed reward and an uncertain fight for justice? More importantly, what will you do the next time life asks you to choose between what's profitable and what's right? Sometimes the most precious treasures are found in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the most extraordinary families are forged in the fires of shared struggle. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to look beyond the surface, you'll find that the person everyone else sees as an enemy might just be the hero you've been waiting for. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? When you had to decide between profit and principle, which path did you take? Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales of courage, love, and the triumph of justice over corruption. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might remind you that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they fight for what they believe in. Until next time, remember, every sunset brings the promise of a new dawn, but the choices we make in the darkness determine what kind of light we'll see when morning comes. The frontier may be gone, but the need for courage, justice, and love remains as urgent today as it was in 1885. Keep fighting the good fight, and never forget that sometimes the most valuable bounty is the one that can't be measured in silver or gold.